So, a little bit more about who the people are who help you do this. 3 things that they have to do. So, for somebody to sit on an appeal board like this, they have to give themselves, and they need to give very generously. And that's probably both in terms of their own wealth, but also in terms of the context of the campaign. So it's very hard if you want to run a £250 million campaign to have an appeal board of people who maybe give less than 100,000, because they have no credibility, right? They're making no inroad on the campaign themselves. Once you've got them to give, they also need to be prepared to get others to give. So they need to use their own networks to reach others and to ask them for money. And that's a really tough thing to ask people to do. It's really hard, right? Asking for money is not easy. And lastly, of course, they need to be a passionate advocate for the cause. Or to sum that up as the Americans would, they need to give and get, or get off your committee. Yeah? So that's how the fundraising really works. This is the gift table that the NSPCC used. So what this table shows is that we were aiming, up at the top there, to get one gift of 50 million, 2 of 25, 3 of 10. Now these sort of gift charts are kind of, there are some rules of thumb. You would expect to get 10 to 20% from your top gift. You would expect that the 80-20 rule applies. So 80% of your money will come from the top 20% of the donors. And, you know, you can spend ages building these gift charts, but all they are is an indication of where you think the money is going to come from. It's challenging, and I'll talk about what happens. So this was our plan. So in about 1997, our plan was to kind of do some feasibility work for about a year, create a steering group of the people who were currently warmest and closest to us, and use them to help us recruit a chair for appeal and the appeal board, i.e. the people who were going to really give to us those big gifts and get more. We were then going to do a private phase, which would have got us to half the money. We were then going to launch and go public, and then eventually we were going to close and consolidate. And the plan was that we would have done that 250 million before 2000 was ended. Okay? It wasn't really like that. This is what it was like. This bit, preparation, feasibility, steering group, took forever. It was extraordinarily difficult to persuade people to do the thing that we wanted them to do. Primarily because, and I alluded to this earlier, we had a grand vision, but we didn't really have the detailed plan of what we were going to do with the money. And this group, everybody we knew already, pushed and pushed and pushed to make us work incredibly hard to sort that out. And that took a long time to develop those plans. We eventually recruited... Does anybody know who this is? Who's this? Anybody? This is Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, who's not terribly well known, but this is who it is. He became our appeal chair. An unusual appeal chair in many ways, but royal in the UK still carries a lot of weight. And it does bring people in. So we eventually recruited the Duke of York to chair the appeal. And that was one of the prime reasons that people then signed up to the appeal board, right? Because they had somebody that they couldn't say no to. The challenge was we had set the public launch for, I can't remember the exact date, I think it was the 22nd of February 1999. And we had intended that the private phase, the half of the money would have largely been done by then. He only came aboard towards the end of the previous year, so we were very slow in having an appeal board, and we were very slow in having a private phase. But we couldn't change the launch date for all sorts of reasons, one of which was that we had a plan to door drop every home in the country, and that material was being printed, so we couldn't hold it back. Door dropping, 50 million homes or whatever it is actually a big undertaking. So what basically happened was that our private phase, despite all of the theory and practice that says you need to do the private phase first, our private phase continued all the way along here. And in fact, the biggest gift that the campaign succeeded in getting, which was 30 million, was the closing gift of the campaign. So a message in all of this is, don't believe the theory. You need to adapt it to your own situation, because just about everything we tried to do didn't necessarily work. Okay? So let me say a few things about what did work. I meant to bring one of these with me because I've discovered that I have a tin at home. You know, one of those random tins you have in your kitchen. I have a random tin of these badges. We created this, the full stop obviously was created as a little badge, a pin badge, green enamel badge. We didn't necessarily plan this, but the way in which the badge took off was it began to be worn by all sorts of people. Politicians, business people, celebrities, sports stars, music artists. People wore it as a symbol of signing up. And I think that's one of the reasons that Full Stop became the cause of the moment. Because that badge became a symbol of kind of, I'm in, I'm with you. And the more people who wore it, the more people who wanted to wear it. And essentially what happened was, when you started sending people invitations to high-value events to come and find out more, they started to come. And so in a way, although we hadn't done the private phase first, by going public and getting people engaged was really important for us because it brought in whole new donors that we never thought we could reach. Yeah? So that was one of the things that worked really well. The second thing was integration. And this is where I now feel about 108, because when I think about what we were doing, it now seems very old school. But what we essentially did was just after the launch, we did a major TV and poster advertising campaign. We also spent our entire annual donor acquisition budget, plus the budget from the year before, in a couple of months. And we, as I said, door-dropped every home in the country, so unaddressed mail, with asking people to sign up to a pledge. And that pledge was this: I promise to do all that I can to help stop cruelty to children. We had more than 500,000 sign-ups. But the interesting thing we asked people to do one of three things. We asked them to sign up to a regular gift. We asked them to become a campaigner, so an advocate, a voice for us. Or we asked them to raise money by doing something. The regular giving piece was very successful and is the reason NSPCC's income grew way beyond the campaign. The campaigner base was really important. It was created from scratch, and we were the next year voted by parliamentarians the most influential charity in the UK. The asking people to fundraise for us didn't work. I will never know what we didn't get right, really, but it didn't work particularly. People didn't do that. So the combination of making it the cause of the moment and also of integrating our activity worked incredibly well. So I said I would talk about some fundamentals and some pitfalls. These are the things, if you want to do this sort of fundraising, that you must get right. So you need the right way to express your case for support, and you need to set the right target. And I'm going to give you one example of a different organisation and the case for support. Anybody know of this organisation? I think they're now active in Poland, which is one of the reasons I've chosen them. Anybody? A little bit? Good. Okay. So Compassion in World Farming is actually a UK organisation, now operating in a number of markets around the world and it's an animal welfare organisation. It's about treating farm animals well. This is the inspirational chief exec, Philip Limbury, and this, in a way, the book down here, is his ultimate case for support. It's about what goes wrong if we do poor farming. But he's got a brilliant way of expressing his case for support. And what he does is he takes a single piece of A4 paper. You've all got one in front of you, I'm sure. And he folds it in half. And he will say, when we started Compassion in World Farming 40 years ago, half the size of this A4 paper is the space a chicken had, right? A battery chicken. And then he opens out the paper and he'll say, and 40 years later, this is the space we've got. And that's not good enough. And the thing I love about that is the entire case for support in a really memorable thing. If you don't remember very much of what I've said today, you will probably remember the case for support for compassion in world farming. And my message to you about that is you need to find that really simple way of explaining what you do. Most of us do really complicated things, but we have to find it make it simple and memorable. You need to set the right target. And lots of people say to me, so how do you set the target? Well, you can work out what it will cost, and you can create a business plan. You can work out what you can raise, or you can just think of a number and double it. And actually, many successful campaigns work best by the idea that they set an inspirational target and then work out how to get it. Yeah? You don't need to know everything to start with. You need to find a critical mass of what I call volunteer leaders. Those people who are going to give you the big gifts and are going to help you get more. These are the fundraising board. This is the hardest part. Finding a board. One of the reasons the NSPCC succeeded, and it relates to this point, you also need a prospect pool that is big enough. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But one of the things the NSPCC had, which it didn't really understand the importance of this asset, was we had an old-style community fundraising operation, which had committees in every county in the country in England who came together to do, bake sales or, tea parties or whatever it was, and raised small amounts of money. Those committees were incredibly well embedded in their local communities. And actually, they were the roots to people of wealth and influence who eventually joined this board. So they didn't come from the central London team knowing everything. They came from the embedded relationships that we had in the community. You can't ignore the maths of these campaigns, though. Remember I showed you the gift table. Some very, very big gifts at the top. Typically in a campaign like this, you need to have 10 cold prospects to get 4 of them involved in what you're doing to get 1 gift. So if you think about the chart I showed you earlier with the number of gifts at each level, you can quickly work out how many prospects you need. And if you can't work out where you're going to get those prospects from, you need to really think about whether this is the right thing to do. And of course, if you fail to get a gift at the very top and you're going to rely on more gifts further down, the number of prospects grows. Does that make sense? And as the number of prospect grows, then the number of people you need to get those gifts grows. So if you can't get the gift table shape is really, really important in making sure that your campaign is feasible. One thing we learned, I talked about sequential asking, about getting the gifts at the top and then letting them follow. What we learned was that you actually need to do it what I've called inside out. So most important for us was getting significant gifts from the people who were closest to us. And I will... So there were lots of stories I could tell, and I will tell one at the very end, about donors who maybe had given us £5,000 or £10,000 who went on to give £100,000. Those were the gifts that made this thing work, because those people were then so committed based on their personal stretch gift that they helped us in any way they could. And then the last thing, which this only works if absolutely everybody in the organisation is behind it, connected and aligned with what you're trying to do. You can't do it as a fundraiser by yourself. It has to be the DNA of the organisation. I said I would try to connect it to the theme of the conference, and I thought very hard about this. So for me, everything I've said holds true today. The what we did and the why we didn't doesn't change at all, at all, at all. I think online world today offers myriads of opportunities to engage and mobilise people far more cost effectively than ever we could. Nobody would dream of door dropping every home in a country now, I don't think. And of course what online does is offer the opportunity for peer-to-peer in a way that was really difficult to do other than at the top level when we did this. I want to finish with 3 stories. One's about a footballer, one's about a drawing room, a posh room in Kensington, very upmarket part of London, and one's about a transformational gift. This is the commentating team for the UK for the World Cup. So do we have some football fans in the audience? Maybe not. Good, one. My 13-year-old footballing mad child was amazed that Mum knew who this man was, the second from the right. He's actually this. Does anybody know who this is? This is Alan Shearer, who was, and this is a very old, picture of the England football team. He's there. I think that's probably David Beckham, actually, looking incredibly young. This is the England football team, all wearing full-stop gear. And this is just one example of the myriads of things we did with famous people to get Full Stop known. And what, of course, Full Stop did, what this did was take Full Stop to an audience who wouldn't normally listen to us. Football supporters are not necessarily an obvious connector to NSPCC. And Alan Shearer was the voice in the original advertising. And the reason I knew who he was because I met him at a royal reception. So my son was very impressed, but not very impressed with the story. This is a second example, which for me talks about the power of volunteers. I went to visit a lady. She was an American. She was married to a British banker. She'd been really helpful in connecting us to people on the appeal board. She was herself on the appeal board. And what she said to me was, this is what I want to do for my bit of the campaign. And what she said was, I want to get John McEnroe to replay Björn Borg. For those of you who are old enough, that was a tennis match at Wimbledon in the 1980s, at the court in Buckingham Palace. And I sat there thinking, this is impossible. How are we going to do this? And I looked her in the eye and I said, well, that's a great idea, but I have no idea how to do that. And she said, Angela, it's easy. And she said, I can call John now. And she called John McEnroe and she got him to say yes. John McEnroe called Björn Borg, who said yes. She also knew a man called Johan Elias, who owned the Head Racket Company, who basically helped sort out the tennis court so that they could play on it. In about 8 weeks, she pulled together an event that raised £1 million, and then one of the committee members doubled it because he thought she'd done a good job. And I guess my message to you is the power of volunteers is extraordinary. The power of connections will bring you things that you cannot find in any other way. And then the last story I don't have a photograph for, primarily because it would show you who the donor was and that wouldn't be fair. But I knew our message was really getting through when a person who'd been a donor to us over a long period of time asked to meet us and came into the office and said, I've been thinking, I've made a gift to Full Stop, but I haven't given enough. And I realised I hadn't given enough because I've bought a car that was worth more than my gift. And he said, I can't do that. That's not okay. And he went on to be £1 million donor. And I guess my story there is the involvement, we would have never got that gift without the campaign, because he would have never worked out what his potential would have been, and asking for it wouldn't have worked. So, I've galloped through a bit of a sort of history lesson, really. If you want to know more about this, if anybody's familiar with Sophie, I can't remember what it's called, the Showcase of Fundraising, Inspiration and Innovation. There is a write-up of the campaign written by this man who, I can't do a full-stop presentation without reference to this man. This was my boss at the time. This is Giles Pegram, who was really the architect of the campaign. He's now written quite a long piece on Sophie. If you are interested, read this, it will tell you more. Do we have time for some questions?
Hello, Alexandra Granada, SOS Children Villages. Thank you for the presentation. I think it was really inspiring. And I think so far in Poland we have one campaign that can be a little bit compared to what you said. And I think it's a great orchestra campaign. It's maybe not... Yep. Have you heard about that?
I heard about
it's
it
like
first time
there
yesterday.
Are badges like Red Hearts. I
Yep.
think all the country knows about the campaign. But for the other organizations, I think we're just probably thinking about starting it or preparing it. So it was really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. This is not easy fundraising to do. There are other examples. So very interesting to me. I presented on this at IFC a couple of years ago. WWF have done a campaign like this, and internationally. So there are other campaigns, but it's not a very common form of fundraising. And even in the UK, there are not that many of them, which is, I think, why it gets talked about so much.
Hello.
Hello.
Could you please tell us how much it cost you?
So great question. And it's actually, I'm not going to dodge the answer, but it's a hard one to answer. Because what eventually happened was the fundraising that we might have called our ordinary fundraising, our business as usual, became integrated with the campaign. The usual rule of thumb is to say that you will spend at least 10% of what you try to raise on doing it. So you could have easily... We talked to the board about the fact we might spend 25 million. I suspect we spent more. And the other thing to bear in mind is that there is quite a time period when you're planning and preparing where you might be spending money, but you're not raising any. Yeah? So there is a sort of curve that goes like that before it grows.
Can you please tell us how to convince people really to become the part of this? You mentioned that it's already challenging, but I really like this concept, and maybe any advice on that topic.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the big thing is that you need to convince people that they want to play a part in helping you achieve the goal. And the goal is the ending cruelty to children. And by the way, we need to raise 250 million to do that. Yeah? Once they're bought in emotionally, you need to really talk to them about how this... You need to share with them how the fundraising works. And you need to have a very honest conversation about whether they are prepared to do the things, give and help you get other gifts, and be a public advocate for the cause. It goes horribly wrong when people aren't honest about what it is that people want to do, and they end up with fundraising boards that don't work because the people didn't know what they were supposed to do. Even when you've got them on board, you need to then work very hard at enabling them to do the asking. So the reality is, in my experience, high-value donors still find it themselves very difficult to ask for money. So in theory, the idea is they say to somebody, I've given £1 million, what would you be prepared to do? They find that very hard to do. And you need to train them how best to ask for money. And you wouldn't, I sometimes say you wouldn't go out and play golf if you had no idea how to hit the ball, right? Why go out and ask for money if you don't know how to do it? And you've got to find a way of getting them to know that you're giving them a skill that will enable them to do it successfully. So training them how to ask for the money is really important. Does that help?